The Mississippi sun hung low over Camp Shelby in the summer of 1943, casting long shadows across the training grounds where young men prepared for a war that felt both distant and terrifyingly close. Among them stood Private James Booker, a 22-year-old farm boy from rural Alabama whose calloused hands had known more about plowing fields than firing weapons. James stood apart from the others, not by choice, but by circumstance. While most recruits came from towns and cities with at least some education, James had barely finished 6th grade before his father's death forced him to take over the family farm. His accent was thicker, his manners rougher, and his understanding of military protocol slower than the rest. What made him truly different, however, was the rifle he carried. Standard-issue M1 Garins gleamed in the hands of his fellow soldiers, modern semi-automatic weapons that represented American industrial might. James clutched something else entirely, a weathered Springfield 1903, a bolt-action rifle that had seen service in the First World War. The wood stock was scratched and faded, the metal showing spots of wear that no amount of oil could hide. Sergeant Marcus Webb, a stocky man from Boston with a pencil-thin mustache, noticed it immediately during morning inspection. His eyes narrowed as he approached James, boots crunching on the gravel. "You still carrying that museum piece, Booker?" James stood straighter, his jaw tight. "Yes, Sergeant. It's what they issued me." Webb circled him slowly, making sure every recruit in the company could hear what came next. "That's because supply figured you couldn't handle a real weapon. That antique there costs $15. Maybe 16 if you count the rust. The M1 your buddies are holding? $85 of American engineering. You know what that tells me?" "No, Sergeant. It tells me the Army thinks you're worth about a fifth of what these other men are worth." Webb's voice carried across the field, drawing snickers from some of the other recruits. "Hell, that rifle is so old, I bet it was primitive when your granddaddy used it." The laughter stung worse than the summer heat. James kept his eyes forward, his knuckles white around the rifle strap. He had heard variations of this speech for 3 weeks now, ever since he had been issued the outdated weapon due to wartime shortages. The other men had started calling him primitive, a nickname that followed him to the mess hall, the barracks, and now the firing range. Private Tommy Russo, a sharp-faced kid from New York with slicked back hair, leaned toward his buddy and spoke just loud enough for James to hear. "Bet he doesn't even know which end the bullet comes out of. Probably used to shooting possums with a slingshot back in the swamp." More laughter rippled through the ranks. Webb silenced them with a raised hand but made no effort to defend James. Instead, he moved on, inspecting the next soldier's weapon with considerably more approval. The morning drills were brutal. While other recruits quickly loaded and fired their semi-automatic M1s, James had to manually work the bolt-action mechanism after each shot, falling behind in every timed exercise. His targets showed decent accuracy, his farm-honed instincts for patience and aim serving him well, but speed was everything in combat simulations, and speed was something his primitive rifle simply could not deliver. During the lunch break, James sat alone under a scraggly oak tree, eating his rations in silence. He thought about his mother back home, about the letter she had sent last week telling him to make her proud, to show those city boys what Alabama grit looked like. He wondered if she would be proud to know they called him primitive, that even the Army seemed to think he was disposable enough to arm with a leftover from the previous war. What he did not know, what none of them could know, was that in 8 months' time, this $15 rifle and the primitive farm boy who carried it would be lying in frozen mud outside a small Belgian town called Bastogne. He did not know that a massive German Panzer would be rolling toward his position, its 75mm cannon capable of obliterating anything in its path. He did not know that his M1 carrying brothers would be scattered, desperate, and out of options. And he certainly did not know that one perfectly placed shot from his outdated, underestimated, primitive rifle would change everything. But that revelation was still months and an ocean away. For now, Private James Booker simply finished his meal, picked up his $15 rifle, and walked back into the judgment and mockery of men who could not yet see what war would soon reveal. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as training continued, and with it, the weight of being seen as less than. But James Booker was used to carrying heavy things. He would carry this too. The weeks that followed became a relentless test of endurance. What started as casual mockery evolved into systematic humiliation, orchestrated primarily by Private Tommy Russo and his group of city boys who seemed to find endless entertainment in tormenting the quiet farm kid with the ancient rifle. They started small. James would return to his bunk to find his rifle missing, hidden in the latrine or buried in the mud behind the barracks. He never complained, simply retrieved it, cleaned it meticulously, and said nothing. His silence only encouraged them. One evening during equipment maintenance, Russo stood before the assembled company and performed an elaborate pantomime of James trying to operate his bolt-action rifle in combat. He exaggerated every movement, pretending to struggle with the mechanism while making explosion sounds and falling dramatically to the ground. And then Primitive here dies because he's still loading shot number 2 while Jerry's already fired 20. The barracks erupted in laughter. Even some of the men who had been neutral before found themselves grinning. Sergeant Webb watched from the doorway, arms crossed, and did nothing to stop it. James sat on his bunk, methodically running an oiled cloth along his rifle barrel. His hands moved with practiced precision, the same way they had moved across plow handles and fence posts back home. He did not look up, did not engage, did not defend himself. The silence made Russo bolder. "You know what I heard?" Russo moved closer, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that everyone could still hear. "I heard they gave him that piece of junk because they're expecting him to die anyway. No point wasting a good rifle on someone who probably can't even read the manual." Several men shifted uncomfortably now. The joke had crossed a line, but nobody spoke up. In the rigid hierarchy of military training, defending an outsider meant risking becoming one yourself. Private Eddie Walsh, a red-headed kid from Chicago who had bunked near James, finally broke the silence. "Come on, Tommy, that's enough." Russo spun toward him, eyes flashing. "You defending Primitive now, Walsh? Want us to find you an old rifle too? Maybe a musket from the Revolutionary War?" Walsh's face reddened, but he said nothing more. The moment passed. The damage was done. That night, James lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of men sleeping around him. He thought about going home, about how easy it would be to fail some test, to wash out of training and return to the farm where at least the land did not judge him, where his tools did not determine his worth. His hand found the rifle beside his bunk, fingers tracing the worn wood. His father had carried a rifle like this in the First War. Had he been mocked too? Had he been called primitive, worthless, disposable? James did not know. His father never talked about the war before he died. But he had come home. Everything changed on a cold October morning when a new officer arrived at Camp Shelby. Captain Raymond Fisher was different from the other commanding officers. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from the North African campaign where he had earned a Silver Star. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen real combat, not just training exercises and parade grounds. During his first inspection, Fisher stopped in front of James. His gaze moved from the soldier's face to the worn Springfield in his hands. Unlike Sergeant Webb, Fisher did not smirk or make jokes. Instead, he reached out and asked to examine the weapon. James handed it over, bracing himself for another round of humiliation. Fisher turned the rifle over in his hands with obvious familiarity. He checked the bolt mechanism, sighted down the barrel, tested the trigger pull. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear enough for the surrounding men to hear. "This is a 1903 Springfield. Bolt action, .30-06 caliber. 5-round internal magazine." He looked up at James. "You know what this rifle did in the First War, Private?" "No, sir." "Not exactly." "It won it." Fisher handed the weapon back. Marine snipers used these at Belleau Wood. Put German machine gunners down at 600 yards. This rifle has more confirmed kills than most modern weapons will ever see. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the other recruits. Any man who mocks this weapon has never seen what a trained shooter can do with it. The silence that followed was deafening. Rousseau's face had gone pale. Even Sergeant Webb stood straighter, suddenly aware that his casual cruelty had been witnessed and judged by someone who actually understood combat. Fisher turned back to James. "What's your name, Private?" "Booker, sir." "James Booker." "You hunt back home, Booker?" "Yes, sir." "Deer mostly." "Sometimes turkey." Fisher nodded slowly. "Then you know patience. You know how to make one shot count. In combat, that matters more than volume of fire." He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Any fool can spray bullets. It takes skill to place one exactly where it needs to go." Something shifted in James at that moment. For the first time since arriving at Camp Shelby, someone had looked at him and seen potential instead of limitation. Someone had looked at his $15 rifle and recognized it as a weapon, not a joke. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated, ever been judged before you had a chance to prove yourself, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because James Booker's story is just getting started, and what happens next will show exactly what one man with an old rifle can do when everything is on the line. Over the following weeks, Fisher personally supervised James's training. He taught him advanced techniques, breathing control, holdover calculations for different ranges. The mockery did not stop completely, but it quieted. Rousseau still sneered, but from a distance now. James practiced until his shoulder bruised from the recoil, until he could work that bolt-action mechanism in his sleep. December 1944. The Ardennes forest in Belgium was nothing like the Mississippi training grounds. Snow fell in thick sheets, turning the world into a monochrome nightmare of white and gray. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero, and the German offensive had caught the Allied forces completely off guard. Private James Booker huddled in a frozen foxhole outside Bastogne, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. His $15 Springfield was ice-cold against his hands even through his gloves. Around him, what remained of his unit tried desperately to hold their position against the massive German counterattack. The sound reached them first. A deep, mechanical rumbling that made the ground vibrate. Through the snow and bare trees, the silhouette emerged like some prehistoric beast, a German Panzer IV, its 75mm cannon swiveling as it searched for targets. "Fall back." Sergeant Webb's voice cracked with panic. "We got no anti-tank weapons." "Move." Men scrambled from their positions, abandoning the line. The Panzer's machine gun opened up, tracers cutting through the snowfall. 2 soldiers went down before they made it 10 yards. The rest scattered into the forest, survival instinct overriding training. James did not move. His mind had gone quiet in a way it never did during training. He thought about Captain Fisher's words. One shot placed exactly where it needs to go. He thought about deer hunting in Alabama, about patience, about waiting for the perfect moment when the animal's vitals aligned with your sight picture. The Panzer rolled closer, crushing frozen vegetation beneath its treads. 50 yards. 40. James could see the commander's hatch was open, but that was not his target. Fisher had taught him about armor vulnerabilities during their private sessions. Tanks were not invincible. They had weak points. "Booker. What are you doing? Get out of there." Tommy Rousseau's voice came from somewhere in the tree line, genuine fear replacing the usual mockery. James ignored him. He steadied the Springfield against the lip of the foxhole, his breathing slowing despite the chaos around him. The Panzer's turret began to rotate toward his position. In seconds, that cannon would fire and his foxhole would become his grave. But James had already found what he was looking for. The vision block. a small rectangular opening in the turret where the gunner looked out to aim. It was maybe 4 inches tall, 3 inches wide. At 35 yards, covered in snow, with a tank bearing down on him, it was an impossible shot. James exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The Springfield kicked against his shoulder with familiar force. The sound of the shot was swallowed by the storm and the engine noise, seeming almost insignificant against the massive steel beast. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then everything changed. The bullet entered the vision block at a slight downward angle, struck the breech of the main gun's loading mechanism, and detonated the 75mm shell that was being loaded. The explosion was catastrophic. From inside the Panzer, the detonating shell created a pressure wave that tore through the tank's interior like the fist of an angry god. Flames erupted from every opening, the commander's hatch, the vision blocks, even the seams in the armor plating. The turret lifted slightly from the force before settling back down at an odd angle. Black smoke poured into the white sky. The surviving crew members who could still move scrambled out, their uniforms smoking, faces blackened by soot. They stumbled into the snow and did not look back. The massive steel beast that had seemed unstoppable moments before now sat immobilized, a burning monument to the impossible shot that had killed it. James remained in his foxhole, the Springfield still against his shoulder, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The entire sequence had lasted maybe 5 seconds. 5 seconds that separated life from death, victory from retreat, belief from doubt. Sergeant Webb was the first to emerge from the tree line, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. He stared at the burning Panzer, then at James, then back at the tank. Behind him, other soldiers began appearing, including Tommy Russo, whose face had gone completely pale. "Booker." Webb's voice was barely audible. "Did you just, with one shot?" James finally lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline catching up with him. "Yes, Sergeant." "What did you hit? How is that even possible?" "Vision block. Got lucky with the shell inside." James's voice was steady despite the trembling in his hands, the same calm tone he had used back in Alabama when explaining how to track a deer through thick brush. "Lucky." Webb shook his head slowly. "Son, luck is finding $1 in your pocket. That was something else entirely." The other men gathered around the foxhole, staring at James with new eyes. The primitive farm boy with his $15 rifle had just done what their modern weapons and all their expensive training could not do. He had stopped a German Panzer with a single bolt-action shot. Russo stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I thought you were dead. I thought we all were." He extended his hand, something he had never done before. "I'm sorry, Booker. For everything I said. Everything I did." James looked at the offered hand for a long moment before accepting it. The handshake was firm, genuine. Around them, other men nodded in agreement, their expressions carrying apologies their words could not quite form. Captain Fisher arrived 20 minutes later, having heard the explosion from the command post. When he saw the destroyed Panzer and heard the story, he simply placed a hand on James's shoulder and smiled. "Told you one shot was all you needed." That night, as the unit dug in for another frozen evening, nobody called James Booker primitive. Nobody mocked his rifle. Instead, they asked him to check their positions, to share his knowledge, to teach them what he knew about patience and precision. September 1955. A crisp autumn afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama. James Booker stood on the porch of his farmhouse, watching his 2 young sons play in the yard. The land looked much as it had when he left 12 years earlier, but everything else had changed. The farm was thriving now, expanded with the money he had saved from his years working at the local hardware store after the war. A car pulled up the dirt driveway, kicking up dust. James smiled when he recognized the driver. Tommy Russo, older now with a few gray hairs at his temples, stepped out wearing a suit that looked out of place in the rural setting. They shook hands, the gesture carrying years of friendship that had been forged in frozen Belgian foxholes. "You came all the way from New York for this?" James asked. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Tommy reached into his car and pulled out a long wooden case. "Besides, I brought you something." Inside the case, resting on red velvet, was James's Springfield 1903. The wood had been refinished, the metal reblued, but it was unmistakably the same rifle. Below it, mounted on a brass plate, were the words, "The $15 rifle that stopped a Panzer." Bastogne, December 1944. Tommy's voice was soft. "They were going to put it in some army museum warehouse. I pulled some strings, called in favors. Figured it belonged here with you." James ran his fingers along the stock, memories flooding back. Captain Fisher's patient instruction. The mockery that had once cut so deep. The impossible shot that changed everything. The men who had become brothers. "You know what I learned from all of it?" James said quietly. "It was never about the rifle. It was about people seeing what they expected to see instead of what was really there. They saw primitive because they wanted to see primitive." "And now?" Tommy asked. "Now I teach my boys that tools don't make the man. That being underestimated can be an advantage if you're patient enough. That one well-placed action matters more than 1,000 careless ones." James smiled. "And I teach them never to judge someone by what they carry, but by what they do when it matters most." The two men stood in comfortable silence, watching the children play as the sun began to set over the Alabama fields. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you for watching. James Booker's journey from mockery to hero reminds us that greatness isn't about having the best equipment or the loudest voice. It's about skill, patience, and courage when everything is on the line. If this story moved you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what moment impacted you most. Subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And let me know in the comments what kind of story you want to hear next. Maybe you have a family member whose story deserves to be told. Share it below. Until next time, remember, never let anyone tell you what you're worth. Show them instead.